tied to a cot in the asylum for refusing a husband. A cowboy unbuckled the straps and gave her choice. The buckle was military surplus. I know because the tongue had a U.S. stamp on it, the kind they put on cavalry tack in the 70s, and here it was holding a woman's wrist to an iron cot frame in what they called a hospital but smelled like a smokehouse and an outhouse sharing a wall. I stood there with my thumb on that brass tongue for longer than I'd like to admit, not because I was afraid to open it, because I was counting. There were 4 of them, one on each wrist, one across her middle, one across her shins, thick brown leather. Somebody had punched the holes with something too small, and all maybe, and the edges were ragged and they'd bled her a little at the wrists, not from cruelty, just from the kind of indifference that's its own cruelty. She was watching me. Hadn't said a word since I came through the window. Most people would have said something. She didn't. I'm going to back up. You need to know why I was there before I tell you what happened after. And I'm going to tell it the way it actually went, which means starting 3 weeks before that room and a town called Cutter's Ford and a man named Orville Breach. My name is Cal Dunmore. I was 38 years old that fall. I've been running a small freight operation out of Cutter's Ford, 6 wagons, 2 of them mine, the rest under contract, and it was not prospering. The railroad had come within 40 miles and it was eating at us the way weather eats at sandstone, slow and certain. By October of that year, I had 1 driver left who wasn't looking for something else, a man named Clement who was 61 and had nowhere better to go, and I had debts I was managing but not defeating. I'm telling you this so you understand I was not a man with extra room in his life. I had enough trouble of my own. What happened was not something I went looking for. It arrived. It arrived on a Thursday, in the form of Orville Breach coming into my freight office and sitting in the chair across from my desk without being invited to sit, which told me something, and setting a leather folio on the desk between us and opening it, which told me more. Orville Breach was the kind of man you find in every territory town once the rough edge is off it. Not old money. There was no old money out here, but money accumulated fast, in the way money accumulates when a man knows what laws are still soft. He owned the lumberyard and a share of the mill, and he held paper on about 1/3 of the storefronts on Main Street. He was 55 or so, wide in the chest and going thick around the middle, and he had the hands of a man who'd done real work 20 years ago and the face of a man who hadn't since. In the folio was my note, $1,400 due the first of the year. He owned it. I hadn't known he owned it. It had come from a bank in Prescott, but there it was with his name on the assignment. He said he wasn't there to collect. He said he was there to make me a proposition. The proposition was this. He wanted me to drive his fiancée to the territorial asylum in Hallbrook. Personal delivery, his words. She had become, he paused here, confused, irrational. She needed care that the town couldn't provide. He had already arranged everything with the doctor there, a man named Pell. She would be received, she would be treated, she would in time improve. He wanted a man he could trust to see her safely there and hand her over to Pell personally. In exchange, he would tear up my note. I asked what she'd done. He said that wasn't relevant. I said I thought it was. He said her name was Nora Voss. She was 32 years old. She had been his intended for 6 months, and she had recently become convinced that certain things were true that were not true and had been saying them around town and causing embarrassment and distress. I asked what things. He said the specifics were medical and he wasn't qualified to go into them. He said Dr. Pell had assessed her by letter and concurred she needed institutional care. I sat with that a while. Then I asked if I could speak with her before I agreed. He didn't like that. He said it wasn't necessary. I said I preferred it. He said she was not well and might be agitated. I said I could handle agitation. After a silence, he agreed. He said she was staying at the Cutter boarding house and he'd arrange for me to speak with her in the sitting room that afternoon. I went. Nora Voss was not confused. I knew it inside 2 minutes, though I stayed an hour to be sure. She was sitting in the boarding house parlor in a straight-backed chair with her hands in her lap, and she was the stillest person I think I'd ever seen. Not the stillness of someone sedated or broken. The stillness of someone who decided to be careful and was executing on that decision. She was, I don't know how else to say this, fine-boned and dark-haired, and the kind of plain that is really a kind of beautiful if you're paying attention, which most men didn't bother to do. Her eyes were gray-green, and they measured me the way you'd measure a stranger on a trail where strangers sometimes meant trouble. I introduced myself and told her Breach had sent me. She said she knew. I told her what he'd proposed. I told her all of it, including the note, including what he'd said about her condition. I did this because it seemed like she deserved to know what the actual situation was, which apparently no one had thought to tell her. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "What do you want to know?" I said I wanted to know what she'd actually done, what she'd actually said. She told me. She'd refused him. That was the beginning of it. He'd asked her to marry him and she'd said no, which in a town like Cutter's Ford in the year I'm talking about was not illegal exactly, but it had consequences. He was the kind of man a woman said yes to or found herself in difficulties she hadn't previously had. She'd said no in April. By June, he was suggesting to people that she was unwell. By September, he'd arranged the letter from Pell. She had not been assessed in person by any doctor. The letter was written based on Breach's description of her behavior, which included items such as refusing a generous offer of marriage, publicly disputing his account of a land deal, and telling a minister's wife that Breach had shorted 2 ranchers on lumber measurements, and she'd seen the books. She showed me the books. She'd kept a copy. She'd known she would need it. I sat there and looked at those figures, and then I looked at her and I said, "You know what he's planning to do." She said, "I know exactly what he's planning to do. The question is what you're going to do." I told her I wasn't going to take her to Holbrook. She said, "He'll call the note." I said, "I know." She looked at me a good long while then. Not with gratitude, not yet. She was too smart for that. She'd learned not to spend gratitude on promises, but with something that was the beginning of reassessment. Like she was revising an estimate. She'd walked into that conversation expecting one thing from me and I had delivered something different, and she was deciding what that meant. I told her I'd think on what to do and come back the next morning. She said she'd be there. She said it dry, meaning she had no place to go, meaning Breach had seen to that, and I felt something shift in my chest at the way she said it. Not pity, something harder than pity. I did not sleep well that night. I went back to Breach in the morning and told him I couldn't help him. He was cold about it. Colder than I'd expected, which told me he'd had this conversation before with other men. He said I had until December 1st on the note, which was 6 weeks away, and he hoped I'd reconsider. He said it the way a man says a thing when he already knows the outcome. He also, as I found out 2 days later, sent a man to the Cutter boarding house to collect Nora Voss under the authority of a writ he'd had drawn up by a judge in Flagstaff, a judge who owed him a favor, because they all owed him favors. The writ said she was a danger to herself. The man he sent was not a lawman. He was a large person who did things for Breach when those things needed to be done quietly. She wasn't there when they came. She'd read the situation the same way I had, which is to say she was a good deal smarter than the situation gave her credit for, and she had moved. She was in the hay storage above a livery 3 streets over with her books and a carpet bag, and she'd sent word to me through the livery boy. I went. I stood in the hay loft in the low light of a November afternoon with this woman I'd known for 3 days and her carpet bag between us, and I told her that Breach was not going to stop. She said, "I know." I said I had a freight barn with a back room where she could stay until we figured out the next step. I said it was not much, but the lock was good and nobody would look there. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I had to think about that, not because I didn't know. Because I wanted to say it right. I said, "Because what he's doing is wrong, and because you didn't do anything wrong, and because I've spent 38 years in this territory, and the thing that has cost me most in that time is walking past wrong things and telling myself they weren't my problem. I was tired of that cost." She picked up her carpet bag. She said, "All right." She stayed in my freight barn for 11 days. I want to tell you about those 11 days the right way, which means not making them into something they weren't. She was a woman in a bad situation using the shelter I could provide. I was a man with a barn and a debt and an increasingly complicated position with the most connected man in town. It was not romantic. It was close quarters, and it was serious, and most of what we did was try to figure out how to get her out of Breach's reach with enough documentation that he couldn't follow. But I will say this. Those 11 days, in the evening after Clement had gone home and the barn was quiet, she'd sit in the back room at the small table I'd put there and she'd lay out her papers, the account books, the copies she'd made of the lumber tallies, a letter she was writing to the territorial attorney general, and she'd work. She worked the way a person works when they know they have to get it right because they won't get another chance. Methodical, Careful, she didn't complain. She didn't ask me to fix it. She was fixing it herself, and she was using my barn as the place where she could fix it. Watching that over those days, I began to understand something about her that you couldn't see in 10 minutes. She was not a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who'd been put in a situation where the tools available to her were tools men controlled, and she was navigating that the only way you can navigate it, which is by being more careful and more thorough than the men who are trying to stop you. The thing I was providing was not rescue. It was the room to work, the space to execute. And I won't pretend that made me feel small. It did the opposite. On the 4th day, she looked up from her papers and said, "You're not what I expected." I asked what she'd expected. She said another breach, smaller maybe, but the same. I asked why she'd thought that. She said because men who offer help in situations like hers usually want something for it, payment of one kind or another. I said, "Do you think I want something?" She looked at me a while. She had a way of doing that, measuring quiet, the gray-green eyes straight on. She said, "I'm starting to think you might just be what you appear to be." I said that would be a first. She almost smiled, not quite, but close enough that I carried it around for the rest of the day. The trouble came on the 11th night. Breach had been patient, which was unusual for him, and I'd taken that patience as a sign he wasn't sure where she was, which was wrong. He was sure. He'd waited because he was thorough, and because he was building the legal scaffolding to do what he wanted to do and make it stick. At about 2 in the morning, Clement came and knocked on my door, which he'd never done before, and he told me that there were 3 men with a wagon outside the freight barn, and one of them had a paper he was showing around. I dressed in under a minute, and I was out my back door and across the alley with my rifle before they'd gotten the barn's side door open. There is a cold clarity that comes over me in situations like that, and I do not apologize for it. It is not bravado. It is simply what I become when the options collapse to a narrow few and I have to choose one fast. I told them to stop where they were. The one with the paper, he was younger than the other 2, nervous, doing his professional best, said he had a legal order for the involuntary commitment of one Nora Voss to be conveyed to the territorial asylum at Holbrook. He said it was signed by a judge and witnessed by a doctor. He said he was authorized to remove her. I said they weren't coming in. He said this was a lawful order. I said the law could come back in daylight with the town marshal standing alongside it, and I would look at what it said, and until then they were leaving. I did not raise the rifle. I did not need to. I had positioned myself in a way that made the options clear enough without rhetoric. The 3 of them looked at each other. The young one with the paper said if I interfered I could be charged. I said possibly, and I was still not moving, and they could do whatever the law allowed them to do starting at first light with the marshal present. They left. I went inside and I sat in the back room with Nora and I told her what had just happened and what it meant. She already knew what it meant. She said, "They'll come back with the marshal." I said yes. She said, "How long do I have?" I said if I had to guess, and I was no lawyer, the marshal wouldn't move before 8 in the morning. She had 6 hours. She looked at her papers. She looked at me. She said, "Then I need to get to the telegraph office in Wickenburg before they do." Wickenburg was 40 miles east. I said, "The next stage doesn't leave until." She said, "I'm not taking the stage." I had a gray horse named Pharaoh who was not fast but was steady and could cover ground all night without breaking down. I got Pharaoh saddled, and I got Nora's carpet bag tied behind the cantle, and I told her what she'd find in Wickenburg and where the telegraph office was. She said, "You're not coming." I said I needed to stay. If I ran with her, it looked like flight, and it confirmed everything Breach was saying. If I stayed, I was a man with a business and a legitimate dispute about the process and a demand to see the marshal, which was a different thing. She needed someone back here slowing the official machinery while she got ahead of it. She stood beside Pharaoh in the dark of the barn, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me that first day at the boarding house. The measuring look. Only this time she wasn't measuring whether to trust me. She was measuring something else, and I didn't know what. She said, "Cal." I said, "Yeah." She said, "If this doesn't work." I said, "It'll work." She said, "If it doesn't, I want you to know I see who you are." She said it plain, no ceremony, the way you'd say something you've decided to say because you might not get another chance. I see who you are, and I know what this has cost you, and I'm not going to forget it. I helped her up. Pharaoh was steady under her, good animal, and she sat a horse like she'd been doing it her whole life, which I later found out she had. She looked down at me from the saddle for a moment in the lamplight from the barn. Then she rode out into the dark. I went back to my office, and I did not sleep. At 7:30, I walked to the marshal's office, which was a man named Cass Tilden, decent enough, not in Breach's pocket as far as I could tell, just slow and cautious the way men are when they're between powerful forces they'd rather not touch. I told him what had happened overnight. I told him about the men at my barn. I told him I wanted to see the legal order in full before anyone entered my property. He looked uncomfortable. He said he'd received a copy of the order himself that morning, and it appeared to be an order. I said appeared was a word that left room. He looked at me a while, and then he said, carefully, that he had received the order, and he was required to act on it, but that he was a thorough man, and he needed to review all the relevant documentation before proceeding, and that would take. He was clearly calculating, a few hours at minimum. I thanked him. I thought, she has until noon at the latest. Wickenburg was 40 miles. Pharaoh could do 40 miles in 9-10 hours on a clear night. She'd left at just past 2. She'd be there by noon. Breach himself appeared at my freight office at 9. He came in without knocking, same as before, and he sat in the same chair, and he looked at me across the desk with the eyes of a man who is still certain he holds the cards. He said, "You're making this harder than it has to be." I said, "For you, yeah, I am." He said he admired stubbornness in a man up to a point, and I had reached that point. He said the note was due December 1st, and he intended to collect. He said he had the legal authority to have Nora Voss committed, and he intended to exercise it. He said I had inserted myself into a matter that was none of my concern, and I was going to bear the costs of that. I said, "I know." He said, "Then why?" I told him the same thing I'd told her, because it was wrong, because I'd spent enough of my life walking past wrong things. He stared at me. He seemed genuinely puzzled. A man like Orville Breach, the levers that move other men are debt and appetite and fear of loss. He did not have a category for doing a hard thing because it was the right thing when there was nothing in it for you. He literally could not understand it. He left without another word. The telegram came at 12:47. I was in my office, having told Clement to look busy and look normal, and the boy from the telegraph office brought it himself, which told me Wickenburg's operator had understood there was some urgency. I read it standing up. It was from Nora. It said she had sent her documentation to the Territorial Attorney General's office in Prescott. It said she had also sent a copy to the Territorial Circuit Judge, not the Flagstaff Judge, the senior circuit judge based in the capital, who did not owe Orville Breach anything. It said the Attorney General's man had replied by return wire that he was reviewing the matter, and that in the interim any commitment order relating to a Miss Nora Voss was to be held in abeyance pending his office's review. Abeyance, that was the word that changed everything. It meant they couldn't touch her. It meant the order was suspended. It meant she'd gotten there in time and made the right contacts and said the right things, and her paperwork had been good enough to make a territorial official take it seriously. I sat down. I put the telegram on my desk and I looked at it for a while, and I thought, she did that. 40 miles on a strange horse in the dark, alone, and she walked into a telegraph office and she pulled off what needed pulling off. That was not my doing. I had given her the horse, and I had given her the 6 hours, and I had stood in front of my barn with a rifle. She had done the rest. I felt it's hard to name right. Not pride exactly, because she wasn't mine to be proud of. Something closer to the feeling you get when you see a piece of work done exactly right by someone who knows what they're doing. A kind of clean satisfaction. Breach did not go quietly. Men like that don't. He called the note 3 days later, a week early, which violated the terms in a technical way that a lawyer in Prescott later used to have it set aside, though I didn't know that yet when he did it. He told his people around town that I was harboring a fugitive, and that I was a man of poor judgment and character, and some of them believed it because they owed him money. And some of them didn't believe it but said nothing because they owed him money. And a couple of them came and told me privately that they thought he was wrong, which cost them something, and I didn't forget those people. Nora came back from Wickenburg 4 days after she'd left. She came back because the Attorney General's review was underway, and she had been asked to provide additional documentation, and the letter requesting it had been routed through the Cutter's Ford post office, which meant she was officially no longer a fugitive if she ever had been, which was now a contested question. She came to my freight office. She looked tired, the kind of tired that settles in after a hard thing is mostly through but not done. And she was carrying her carpet bag, and she looked around my office like she was seeing it for the first time in daylight, which in a sense she was. She said, "I need somewhere to stay while the review goes forward." I said she could have the back room in the freight barn again. She said, "That won't be necessary." She said it looking straight at me. "I'd like to rent your office spare room, the one above, properly, with rent and terms and no obligation attached." I said the room was used for storage. She said she'd help me clear it. We cleared it that afternoon. We moved boxes and a broken harness and a collection of things that had accumulated in there over 6 years and had no earthly purpose I could identify. She did not complain about the dust. She did not ask me to do the lifting for her. She worked alongside me in the angled afternoon light coming through the single window, and I will say this. There is something about working alongside a person toward a concrete shared purpose, something about the ordinary physical fact of it, that tells you things about that person that conversation doesn't reach. She was steady. She was efficient. She made decisions, this goes here, that goes out, without needing to consult anyone and without second-guessing herself. The room came together. When we were done, she stood in the middle of it and she looked around and she said, "This will do." I said, "It's not much." She said, "It's mine, that's what matters." The Attorney General's review took 6 weeks. During that time, the question of my note remained technically unresolved. And during that time, Breach's man came twice more to the freight office on officialish pretexts that were really surveillance. And during that time, I had exactly 2 more jobs come in because nobody wanted to be seen giving Cal Dunmore freight work while Orville Breach was in dispute with him. Nora paid her rent. She did not ask about the note. She did not tell me not to worry. She did not offer help I hadn't asked for. But one evening I was at my desk with the ledger and I said out loud, to no one in particular. She was at the table in the corner, working on her own papers. I said, "It doesn't add up." She said, "May I?" I pushed the ledger across the desk. She sat down on the other side. She went through it for about 20 minutes without saying anything. Then she pointed to 3 lines and she said, "These rates are too low." She said, "You're undercutting yourself against the stage company on these routes because you're afraid they'll take the work. But the stage company won't take this work. They don't go to these locations. You don't have a competitor on these 3 routes. You have a monopoly and you're charging as if you don't." I looked at where she was pointing. She was right. I said, "How do you know where the stage routes run?" She said she'd read the Territory Transit Directory when she was working on the lumber discrepancy, because the shipping routes affected when deliveries were logged. I looked at her. She looked back, that gray-green steady look. I said, "What do I owe you for this?" She said, "Nothing, consider it rent." I looked back at the ledger, 3 routes. I did the math in my head on what corrected rates would mean over a year. It was not nothing. I said, "Nora." She said, "Cal." I said, "Thank you." She went back to her papers. The review came down on a Tuesday in December, 2 days after Breach had been formally notified that the Attorney General's office was recommending a secondary investigation into the lumber short measurements and the process by which the commitment order had been obtained. The commitment order was voided. The Flagstaff judge received a letter he would not have enjoyed reading. Dr. Pell's correspondence with Breach was entered into the territorial record. It did not ruin Breach overnight. Men like that have too many walls for one Breach to finish them. But it moved the ground under him, and he knew it. And people who owed him money but had their own pride began to recalculate. And within a year, 2 of his biggest debtors had refinanced with a bank in Phoenix, and he'd had to sell his share of the mill. And 5 years later, he was a smaller man in a smaller office, and the whole valley knew why. I heard all this secondhand. By then I was not in Cutter's Ford. Nora left in February. She had family in Colorado, a sister, and the review being finished meant her documentation would follow her, her reputation reestablished, and she had a life to go build that did not involve a dusty freight office above which she rented a room. She came to tell me she was leaving the evening before the morning stage. We sat in my office. The lamp was turned down the way it always was in the evenings, and the cold was coming through the window frame the way it always did, and it was just the two of us in that room, the same as it had been most evenings for 6 weeks, and I had gotten, I want to say accustomed, but that's not the right word. It's too small. I had gotten dependent on it in a way I wasn't prepared to give up without feeling the loss. I told her Colorado was good country. She said her sister had a house and land there, and she was thinking about establishing a practice. I asked what kind of practice. She said she'd been doing bookkeeping and accounts management informally for years, and she thought she could do it formally on her own terms. I said she could do that. She said, I know. There was a quiet. She said, I want to say something. I said, all right. She said, I have met a lot of men in my life who offered help and extracted payment. And I have met men who offered help and meant it, but wanted to be the strong one, wanted to be the one doing the saving, wanted something of a particular kind in return, even if they didn't know it. You were neither of those things. You gave me the room to work. When I needed to ride to Wickenburg, you gave me the horse, and you stayed behind to buy me time, and you did not need to come along to be the hero of it. I want you to know that I see the difference between those things. Most people don't. I did not say anything for a moment, not because I didn't have anything to say, because I needed to be careful about how I said it. I said, you did the work, I held the door. She said, yes, that's exactly right, and holding the door is not nothing, it's what made the rest possible. She paused. I want to come back through this way, if that would be welcome. I said, you know where the office is. She said, I do. We stood up. She put out her hand, which was a formal gesture and also something more than formal, and I took it. Her grip was firm and dry, and she held my hand for a moment longer than a handshake requires, looking at me with the gray-green steady eyes. Not with gratitude, though that was in it. With, the best I can name it is recognition. The look of one person recognizing another person across all the ways the world tries to make you less than what you are. Then she let go. She picked up her bag and she walked out. I stood in the freight office for a while after, the lamp burning low, the cold at the window, the ledger on the desk with 3 routes marked in her hand, higher rates, rates I was already using, rates that were pulling the operation back from the edge it had been on. A man takes stock those moments. You look at what you have and what you've spent and whether the accounts balance. I had $1,400 of debt set aside, being contested. I had 3 routes at correct rates and 2 new contracts from men who'd heard I was the kind who didn't fold. I had a freight barn I owned, and a good horse named Pharaoh, and a driver named Clement who had nowhere better to be, which I counted as loyalty. I had done a thing because it was right and been asked to pay for it, and paid it, and it had come out, not the way I'd planned it, but out. I had stood in front of my barn with a rifle at 2 in the morning and not moved, and I had given a woman a horse in the dark and trusted her with the hard part because she was the one equipped to do the hard part, and both of those had been the right call. I had not needed to be the biggest thing in the story to matter in it. It was a thing I was still learning at 38 years old, and I will tell you honestly, it is not an easy thing to learn. In March she wrote, a real letter, not a wire, which meant it had taken 3 weeks to arrive. She wrote about her sister's place, and the land and the practice she was starting, and she mentioned a particular problem with a mining concern's accounts, that she'd sorted out, and described it in a way that told me she was thriving and finding the level she was capable of finding. At the end, she said she would be traveling through Cutter's Ford in April on her way to Prescott for a legal matter. I wrote back and said I would make sure there was somewhere to stay. She arrived on a Thursday, same day of the week she had first come into my life, which I noticed. She came through the freight office door and the light was behind her, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking around like she was checking whether it was the same as she'd left it. It mostly was. The ledger was on the desk. The lamp was on the hook. She looked at me, the measuring look, the gray-green steady look, only this time it settled into something different. She smiled. Not the almost smile from the barn that I'd carried around for a day. A real one. It did something to the room. She said, the rates on the northern route. Did you adjust them the way I suggested? I said yes. She said, good. She came and she sat down across from me, and she put her bag on the floor and she said, I have 4 days before I need to be in Prescott. I said 4 days is enough time. She tilted her head slightly. She said, enough time for what? I said, that's a good question. She laughed. I had not heard her laugh before. It was not what I would have predicted. It was unguarded and brief and real, the laugh of a person who is occasionally surprised into joy. I said, "Are you hungry?" She said she was starving. She said she'd been on the stage since before dawn and the food at the swing station had been a theological argument for fasting. I closed the ledger, I put on my hat. We walked out of the freight office together into the April afternoon, the main street of Cutter's Ford, the dust, and the smell of new lumber from somewhere, and the long shadow of the afternoon coming down the mountains to the west. She walked at my side with her bag over her shoulder, and she was not leaning on me, and she was not looking to me for direction, and I was not managing or guiding or deciding anything except which restaurant had the better food today, which was Marta's on the south end. We walked. The light was long and the air was cold still, the way April is in that country, and my freight office was behind me and my debt was mostly resolved, and the work was coming back, and the most capable person I had ever known was walking at my side by her own choice and her own will, and she looked like she knew exactly where she was going. So did I. I said at the beginning you need to know about the buckle. The U.S. stamp, the cavalry surplus, the ragged holes. I should finish that. When I went back to unbuckle the straps that night, this is later, this is after Wickenburg, this is a piece I left out and I'm coming back to now because that's how memory works. It doesn't go in order. I need to tell you that those buckles were not mine to undo that night. There were others. There were other women in that place, and Breach was not the only man who had put someone there, and I did not have enough horses or enough time to fix all of it, and that is a weight I carry still. What I had was one set of hands and one woman's situation in front of me, and I could do that one thing. The wrist strap was tight. I worked the tongue out and the leather was stiff and it took longer than it should have. When it came loose, she didn't move right away. She held still for a moment with her wrist free, and she looked at it like she was confirming it was real. Then she looked at me. She said, "The other three." I said, "I know." I undid the other three. She sat up slowly. She swung her legs off the cot. She pressed her bare feet to the cold floor and she breathed. She was wearing what they'd put her in when they brought her there, a gray institutional shift, and her hair was loose and her wrists were lightly bled from the leather, and she was, in that moment, the most composed person in that room. She looked at me, she said, "How?" I said, "I came through the window." I said, "I have a horse and I know the road north and we need to go now." She stood up. She said, "My bag, they took my bag." I said we'd have to leave it. She said my papers were in it. I said I knew. I said she'd made copies and the copies were in Wickenburg, and I told her exactly where. She stood there calculating in the dark for 3 seconds. Then she said, "All right." I gave her my coat. She did not argue about taking it. She put it on and we went out the window and across the yard and over the back fence and to where Pharaoh was tied in the brush by the creek, and she was not soft about any of it. She mounted like a person who has made a decision and does not need to revisit it. We were clear of Hallbrook before midnight. The road north was cold and the stars were out, and she rode just behind my shoulder. I had a second horse, a rented bay, and she did not talk much for the first hour, which was the right call because we were moving fast and talking draws attention, and she knew that. After the first hour, she said, "Cal." I said, "Yeah." She said, "The papers in Wickenburg, if they're still there." I said they were still there. I said she'd sealed them with the operator and he was expecting her. She said, "Then we still have a case." I said, "We still have a case." She was quiet again for a while. Then she said, "I'm going to remember this." I didn't answer that. The road was dark and Pharaoh was steady, and the cold was the kind of cold that keeps you honest, and we had 40 miles to cover and a telegraph to send, and whatever came after. But I'll tell you the thing I didn't say on that road. I was going to remember it too. April again years later. Same light, same shadows off the mountains. The freight operation is doing fine, better than fine. The 3 northern routes, the rates she told me to charge, which I have charged ever since, they kept us through 2 bad winters and a stretch when the railroad ate most of the contract work in the southern corridor. Clement is still with me. He's 68 and I've told him the job is his as long as he wants it, and he has nodded and gone back to work, which is how Clement expresses gratitude. Nora has been in Cutter's Ford for 3 years now. The practice she started is the best accounts and land management outfit in this part of the territory, and 2 of the men who were Breach's biggest debtors are now her clients. which is a justice so clean it makes me smile to think about. She has her own office on the south end. She has her name on the door. She comes to my office some evenings. She comes and she sits across the desk, and we work or we talk or we don't talk, and the lamp burns low and the cold is at the window. She came by her own choice, and she stayed by her own choice, and she chose what this became, same as she chose everything else in her life once the straps were off and the road was open. I did not save her. I want to be clear about that. I held the door. I gave her the horse. I stood in front of my barn with a rifle, and I did not move. She did the rest. And the rest of it, this life, these evenings, this woman who looks at me across my own desk with those gray-green eyes and knows who I am and chooses to be here, that is not something I take for granted for a single day. I know what I am. I know what I've done and what I haven't done. I know what I'm worth and I know what I'm not. Most men don't get to have that reckoned honestly by a person they respect, and then have that person choose to stay. I got that. That's enough. That's more than enough. The lamp is still burning. She's reading something at the table. In a minute she'll look up and tell me something she's found in the numbers, something I've missed, and I will listen and she will be right and we will go from there. That's how it is. That's how it's been for 3 years, and I don't imagine it changing. A man could do a lot worse than this. A man could do a lot worse than sitting across from someone who sees him plain and stays. I tried the door once and it opened. I am still, even now, even after everything, a little surprised that it did.